Christmas Eve 1944, the 1st Battalion Calgary Highlanders manning forward positions in the Netherlands that night had little reason to feel any holiday spirit. There was a little snow on the ground, and word had come down that their traditional turkey dinner had been postponed for a week. The sound of Christmas caroling reached the positions of the forward rifle sections, emanating from the German lines. Canadians responded with small arms and mortar fire. 2 Highlanders had been killed that day, and officers like Bill Lister would be spending time on Christmas the next day writing to next of kin. For the men going out on patrol that night, it was just another day. Stories of the Christmas truce of 1914 have been amplified in popular media. Many mainstream films and schmaltzy advertisements have painted a picture of widespread fraternization across the Western Front. In actual fact, the truces, there were more than one, were organized locally, were small in scale, few in number, and had no measurable operational impact. And yet even in Canada, which had no troops in action in 1914, the idea of Christmas at the front has become a means to portray soldiers as unwilling pawns or even as victims. Few images more effectively convey the hardship of long separation from home than the thought of soldiers missing the most wonderful time of the year. That framework is often applied to Canadians in the Second World War as well.
Happy Christmas. Frohe Weihnachten.
There is no doubt the soldiers serving in 1st Canadian Army in 1944 were acutely aware of the sacrifices they were making.
From the supply ports of Belgium, thousands of mail bags containing Christmas parcels pour in.
It was the 5th winter of the war, and many had been in Europe since 1940, without any home leave or even a telephone call to loved ones in Canada, a level of isolation nearly impossible to fathom today. The winter of 1944 was marked by unusually cold temperatures. This video will briefly examine what Christmas was like for Canadian soldiers at the front that winter, and balance it against the romantic conception fostered by films and social media that has shaped how we imagine Christmas at the front. Historically, winter weather in temperate regions such as Europe reduced military operational tempo, and Christmas was a time of relative quiet, even for armies on campaign. Spring and summer brought mobility and greater freedom from disease. There were exceptions, such as George Washington's famous attack across the Delaware River near Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas Day, 1776. The defending garrison of Hessian troops were thoroughly surprised and badly beaten, and a battered Continental Army on the brink of collapse saw a sudden resurgence of morale, renewed faith in the cause, and a surge of re-enlistments. Part of the battle's lore is that the Hessian commander hadn't bothered to entrench his men and retired with his officers for Christmas dinner. Even a century later, no major set-piece fighting outside of sieges took place at Christmas time in major conflicts like the Crimean War. That pattern continued into the Boer War at the turn of the 20th century. The unique nature of the American Civil War means that this recreation of a local truce in the film Gods and Generals has a ring of truth to it.
Billy Yank!
Local acts of fleeting contact between enemies were not unheard of, but were not officially sanctioned by higher headquarters either. Canadian soldiers on the Western Front of the First World War had their first Christmas in trenches in 1915, when orders specifically forbade a repeat of the previous winter's truces. The use of poison gas by the Germans had shattered illusions of a gentleman's war, and as tanks, flamethrowers, and more lethal gases came into service, soldiers on both sides remained dedicated to fighting the war and killing the enemy, regardless of the season. The 1st Canadian Division experienced the Canadian Army's first frontline Christmas of the Second World War in December 1943 while locked in heavy combat along the Moreau River. In recent years, a favorite story has been the fabled Christmas dinner at Ortona. This famous photograph has been passed off for decades as an image of the Seaforth Highlanders' Christmas dinner. Most recently, the British Muzzleloaders channel did a deep dive into the famous photo, and the surprising conclusion can be seen in this video. There's also a link in the video description. The Army did its best to continue long-standing Christmas traditions inherited from English and American culture.
The largest turkey farm in Canada has gone all out to make sure that every Canadian soldier will have a slice of succulent fowl this Christmas Day.
A year later, there were 2 Canadian divisions and an armoured brigade in action in Italy. One unit of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade, the Calgary Tanks, had chicken and lamb for Christmas in 1944, with creamed potatoes, peas, cauliflower, plum pudding and custard sauce, oranges, a bar of chocolate per man, and vermouth to top up their coffee. The most probably preferred the rum punch, which the regimental historian suggests was more rum than punch. In keeping with the English Boxing Day tradition where masters served their household staff, Officers and NCOs in the Canadian Army served the other ranks at Christmas. Vancouver's Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, spending their second Christmas in Italy in 1944, spent weeks planning what the regimental historian called a bang-up Christmas dinner. Local turkeys, geese, and chickens were rounded up. Bully beef, canned corned beef, which was a tolerated but unloved staple, was bartered for pigs, and battalion cooks, pipers, and clerks labored to provide a memorable meal on the 27th of December, the first day the unit could be rotated out of frontline positions into billets. The banquet hall in Russie could hold one company at a time, and so A, B, C, D support and headquarters companies rotated through for their pork and turkey dinner, served by the sergeants, warrant officers, and officers of the battalion to the men. Every Canadian infantry battalion had its own cooks, and despite the inevitable jokes about army food, regimental histories, war diaries, and contemporary unit newsletters often sang their praises, particularly on occasions like this when their work directly affected unit morale. The bulk of Canada's overseas formations in December 1944 were on what was known as the Nijmegen salient. The U.S. 82nd Airborne Division captured the city alongside the British Guards Armoured Division during Operation Market Garden. That operation ended in the last days of September 1944, when the drive north stalled and the British Airborne Division at Arnhem was effectively destroyed. The 82nd was relieved in early November by Canadian forces that had recently concluded their own strategic operations on the Scheldt estuary. Among them was the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Dan Spry. According to Jeffrey Williams, it was the first time that General Spry's men had had direct dealing with Americans. They were intrigued by their language, which was familiar but seemed non-military. Torches were flashlights. Petrol was gasoline. They were fascinated by their equipment, their weapons, and their rations. They liked the U.S. .30 caliber carbine, but wouldn't swap a Browning automatic rifle for a Bren. In fact, there was little that the Americans had that they envied, certainly not their rations, nor their clothing. Everyone shivered in that damp November, but the Americans looked colder. As one battalion commander put it, they were great guys, good soldiers who had fought well. We gained a great respect for them, but their ways were not our ways. 1st Canadian Army settled into static positions along the Ma River and started planning their next major offensive, an attack southeast from Nijmegen to clear the west bank of the River Rhine, the great moat protecting Germany proper. The attack was tentatively set for early January, and the 2nd Canadian Corps, commanding 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions and 4th Canadian Armoured Division, expected a period of rest and refitting and a quiet Christmas. A surprise German offensive launched on December 16th, but the Canadians were located far to the north and saw no major action. The port of Antwerp, finally in use by Allied shipping thanks to the Canadians' actions clearing the Scheldt estuary, was the German strategic objective. Heroic local actions by a number of American divisions stopped the offensive far short. Careful management of the northern flank by Field Marshal Montgomery minimized the danger to Antwerp and the Canadians. On the south flank, the U.S. Third Army under General Patton broke off an offensive drive to the east, turned 90 degrees on frozen roads, and raced to link up with the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. Life for Canadians in the Nijmegen salient was characterized by patrols and artillery fire, and a routine very much like the First World War, with 2-week tours in the front line and a week rotated out to reserve, with hot baths, church parades, movie nights, and leave to nearby cities like Brussels. In the line, the infantry lived in slit trenches, another example of the difference in terminology inherited from the British. The Americans used the term slit trench to refer to their latrines, and called the fighting positions foxholes. The Canadians' trenches in the salient were roomy enough for two, about 8 feet wide by 2 feet and 4 feet deep, covered with whatever locally available materials were on hand, doors, planks, or branches. A roof with about 2 feet of dirt helped keep some warmth in. Infantry signaller Frank Holm wrote after the war that, "Even if you have covered your slit trench, you still have the problem of insulating yourself from the cold ground. 2 or 3 inches of straw on the bottom almost makes it cozy. When you consider that each man had his long underwear, a shirt, a sweater, a wool serge battle dress, a leather jerkin, and 2 woolen blankets, he had no reason to complain of the cold." Holm was serving with the Calgary Highlanders of the 2nd Division. The unit had benefited through their association with R.B. Bennett, formerly Canada's Prime Minister from 1930 to 1935, and longtime honorary colonel of the regiment. The wealthy Calgary lawyer had paid for holiday turkeys to be supplied to the 1st Battalion every year from 1940 on. On the 24th of December 1944, the battalion was not in a festive mood. Word had come down that the Christmas turkeys would be delayed until New Year's. There was no snow in their sector, but temperatures were so low that their water trailer had frozen solid. A second trailer was brought up from the rear battalion headquarters, and it too was found to be frozen. As the battalion staff worked out a plan to thaw them out, the sound of music from an accordion and bugle drifted over from the German lines. The war diary noted that our men reciprocated, providing a symphony concert from our rifles, Brens, grenades, and mortars. The holiday spirit was most seriously dampened by the loss of 2 men killed that day, bringing the month's death toll to 9, the least costly period of the battalion's 10 months at the front. Private Joseph LaFontaine was just 19 years old when he was killed the day before Christmas, 6 months after his older brother had been killed in Normandy with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada from Winnipeg. The other soldier was Private Austin Nichols Yeoman, serving in Captain Bill Lister's company. Lister was interviewed for a regimental history in 1992.
And that afternoon, the stretcher bearer came, 2 stretcher bearers came with a lad on it who had just been killed, and his name was Private Yeoman. And of course it was the company commander's duty to write to his parents. So I remember sitting down and writing a letter to Mr. Yeoman. And I got a lovely letter back from him, and he said he knew how I felt when I wrote that letter. But he said, don't feel bad because I was in the First World War and I know what you're talking about. Because I told him what a brave son he had and all this sort of stuff, and I didn't even know the lad. But that was our job.
On Christmas morning, Brigadier McGill and the CO, Lieutenant Colonel Ellis, visited the companies who reported the Germans had serenaded them with singing and a bass tuba playing Christmas carols along with O Canada. On the evening of the 25th, the RSM took 2 pipers up to the D Company positions to return the favor. Yeoman and LaFontaine were the last Calgary Highlanders to die in 1944. At the stroke of midnight, as the calendar changed to January 1st, 1945, the Germans directed a concentration of machine gun and mortar fire at B Company's positions. When the fire lifted, after a moment's silence, one of the Germans shouted to the Highlanders a hoarse, "Happy New Year." Later that day, the regiment finally got their Christmas meal, a lunch consisting of turkey with dressing, pork, potatoes, creamed carrots, and Christmas pudding for dessert with tea and beer. Supper, the war diary reported, was also an exceptional meal of roast pork, applesauce, potatoes, and gravy with mince pie. For Frank Holm, manning the line with C Company, he remembered the meal being brought up by Universal Carrier as a small tin of boiled turkey, a tin of Christmas pudding, and hot tea. There wasn't much liquor on the line, but each evening's rations were accompanied by a shot of 1 ounce of Army rum. Patrolling continued, and on January 3rd, the Highlanders suffered their first fatal casualty of 1945. By war's end, after 10 months at the front, they had lost around 450 men killed and many times that number wounded. Those who have not experienced war often speculate about why the soldiers didn't just throw their guns away and refuse to fight. In a chapter of his memoir entitled Christmas 1944, infantry signaller Frank Holm wrote about the dangerous business of patrolling the Nijmegen salient, noting that, "We lost a few men on those night patrols. One has to wonder whether it was worth it." It has become fashionable to read comments like that and link them to the romantic conception of the Christmas truces of 1914, assuming that the men were at best unwilling pawns, and at worst victims passively submitting themselves to slaughter. In the dark moments at Christmas time, far from home, it was natural for men to question war's meaning. But years later, writing his memoir, Holm had a different perspective. "I knew that our aim to destroy the Nazi war machine was just. Had the Germans not committed aggression on many countries in Europe? Although I had been afraid most of the time and had endured many difficult periods, I came through relatively unharmed, except for my nerves, and was glad to have had the experience. I was proud of the accomplishments of the Canadian Army at this crucial time in history, and was proud to have been a Canadian soldier." Similar thoughts of taking on a tough but vital job are echoed often in veterans' accounts. They help explain why there was no mass defections or refusals to fight at Christmas time. There were plenty of reasons for Canadians to want to fight in 1944. Fascism, the persecution of the Jews and other minorities, the subjugation of an entire continent. Those motivations didn't evaporate at Christmas. Instead, the season offered Canadian soldiers in Europe a brief and well-earned respite. The 1st Canadian Army returned to active operations in February 1945, rested and replenished, for the final campaigns west of and then across the Rhine into Germany, where they finished the job they went to Europe to do.